Sarah, an aspiring artist who sketched in a cramped attic studio, helped an elderly vet gather his spilled groceries and stocked his bare cupboards without seeking reward. The next day, a gruff captain appeared at her door with an incredible mural project. Hello everyone, welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today, I'm going to share another heartwarming story. So let's dive into it. Sarah's pencil hovered over the sketchbook, her hand trembling slightly as she shaded the curve of a street lamp. The attic studio smelled of turpentine and old wood, sunlight streaming through a cracked window to pool on her frayed jeans. A jar labeled Art Fund in marker sat on the desk. Its contents, a crumpled $10 bill, quarters and dimes, glinting faintly. She'd saved for 2 years, skipping lunches and second-hand art sales, all for a single dream, professional-grade oil paints. Her fingers traced the jar's rim. Just a little longer, she thought. Downstairs, her mother's voice called, "Sarah, dinner!" But Sarah barely heard. Her sketch, a bustling market scene alive with color, was missing something. Heart, she decided. She just needed to find it. As she put down her pencil and stretched, Sarah glanced at the savings jar. $200. Not a fortune by any means, but to her it represented countless sacrifices. The professional Winsor & Newton oil set she'd been eyeing cost exactly that amount. With those paints, she could finally create the rich, layered pieces she'd been visualizing for months. Her current student-grade paints simply couldn't capture the depth and luminosity she sought. She'd been saving diligently, recording each deposit in a small notebook tucked beneath the jar. Just yesterday, she'd added another $5 from her allowance, bringing her tantalizingly close to her goal. Sarah reluctantly left her sanctuary and headed downstairs for dinner. Her parents exchanged knowing glances as she described her latest project, her voice animated with passion. Her father, a carpenter with calloused hands and a gentle smile, nodded approvingly. "You've got a gift, Sarah," he said, passing her the potatoes. "Just don't forget to live in the real world, too." Her mother, who worked double shifts as a nurse, squeezed her hand. "Art feeds the soul," she agreed, "but remember to feed your body, too." After dinner, Sarah helped with the dishes, her mind still swirling with colors and compositions. Her younger brother, Alex, teased her about her head in the clouds, but there was affection in his voice. Their modest home, with its creaking floorboards and mismatched furniture, had always been filled with encouragement for Sarah's artistic pursuits, even if money for supplies was tight. The autumn air bit at Sarah's cheeks as she walked home from school the next day, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk, and the scent of cinnamon from a nearby bakery made her stomach growl. She'd skipped lunch again, adding another $1 to her mental tally for the art fund. She paused at the corner of Elm and Fifth, where an elderly man in a faded Marine Corps cap struggled with 2 overflowing grocery bags. His hands shook as he adjusted his grip, a paper sack tearing at the seam. Apples rolled into the street. "Let me help," Sarah blurted, darting forward. The man hesitated, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "I'm fine, miss," he said, voice gravelly but polite. Sarah crouched to retrieve the apples, noticing the scar that snaked up his left wrist. Pale, precise, surgical. "Please," she said softly. "It's just groceries." He relented with a sigh. "Name's Thompson. Henry Thompson." As they walked, he spoke in clipped sentences. Widowed, recovering from knee surgery, no family nearby. Sarah's chest tightened as she listened, recognizing the loneliness beneath his matter-of-fact tone. When they reached his apartment, a weathered brick building with a flickering porch light, she glimpsed his nameplate. H. Thompson, Apartment 3, B star. "Thank you kindly," Mr. Thompson said as she helped him set the bags on his kitchen counter. "These old hands aren't what they used to be." He flexed his fingers demonstratively, the joints swollen with arthritis. "It's no trouble," Sarah assured him. "I live just a few blocks away." Mr. Thompson's place smelled of mothballs and brewed tea. The living room was sparse: a plaid couch, a TV with a cracked screen, a single framed photo of a young woman in a nurse's uniform. "My Margaret," he said, catching Sarah's glance. She nodded, throat tight. In the kitchen, the cupboards were nearly bare: a half-empty box of cereal, a jar of peanut butter, a lone can of soup. "Were you a Marine?" Sarah asked, gesturing to his cap. Mr. Thompson nodded, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. "Korea, 1951 to 53. Not that anyone remembers that war anymore." Sarah's gaze lingered on the photo of Margaret. Her smile was warm, her arm looped through Mr. Thompson's in the picture. He'd been broader then, unbroken. Now he leaned against the counter, exhaustion etched into his posture. "Thank you, miss," he said. "Most folks don't stop for old vets anymore." Sarah swallowed. "It's nothing." But as she left, the image of that empty pantry clung to her. That night, Sarah lay awake, the art fund jar glowing in the moonlight. Her fingers brushed the bills. $200. Enough for the paints, the easel, the brushes I've been dreaming about. She thought of Mr. Thompson's empty cupboards, his trembling hands, the loneliness in his apartment. She thought of Margaret's photo, the only spot of warmth in that sparse living room. She sat up abruptly. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 2 a.m. Sarah knew what she had to do, even as part of her rebelled against the idea. Those paints represented her future, her dreams. But Mr. Thompson's present reality seemed so much more pressing. The next morning, Sarah withdrew the entire contents of her art fund jar. At the grocery store, she carefully selected items that would last: canned vegetables, rice, pasta, bread, eggs, milk, coffee, and fresh fruit. She even splurged on a small fruit pie, remembering how her grandfather had loved dessert. The total came to $187.43. She tucked the remaining money into an envelope. Mr. Thompson answered the door on the third knock, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Miss Sarah." "It's just groceries," she echoed his words from the day before, smiling faintly. Inside, she stocked his fridge and cupboards, working methodically as he watched in bewildered silence. When she finished, she handed him the envelope with the remaining cash. "I can't accept this," he protested, his voice gruff with emotion. "Please," Sarah said, "for emergencies." She tucked a note under his sugar jar before leaving. "For Mr. Thompson. Eat well. S." Her mother's voice trembled that evening when Sarah came down for dinner. "Sarah, your jar. It's empty." Sarah looked up to see her mother standing in the doorway of her room, the empty art fund jar in her hands. "I know," she said, avoiding her father's gaze as he appeared behind her mother. "It was an emergency." "What kind of emergency costs exactly $200? Her father asked, his voice gentle but firm. Sarah explained about Mr. Thompson, the groceries, his empty cupboards. Her parents exchanged glances, part concern, part pride. "Art isn't a luxury," her dad said too gently. "But people aren't either," Sarah replied. Her mother set the empty jar back on the desk. "We raised you right," she said simply. "But Sarah, that was your dream." Sarah nodded, a lump in her throat. "I know, but it can wait. Mr. Thompson can't." The next week, Sarah spotted a flyer at the library. Veterans Food Drive. A photo of Mr. Thompson, grinning beside a mountain of donated cans, accompanied an article titled "Kindness from a Stranger." A neighbor had snapped Sarah delivering groceries and posted it online. The image had gone viral in their small community. "Our town's guardian angel," the caption read. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She hadn't done it for recognition. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, caught her looking at the flyer. "That's you, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded reluctantly. "What you did, It sparked something, Mrs. Chen continued. People are talking about it, about how we treat our veterans. She pressed a $20 bill into Sarah's hand. For your art supplies, she said firmly. Don't argue. Over the next few days, donations poured in. $20 from a retired teacher, $50 from a local bakery owner. For your jar, they'd say, pressing envelopes into her hands. Sarah's cheeks burned. I didn't do it for this, she'd protest. We know, they'd reply. That's why we're doing it. At the grocery store, a woman in a veterans advocacy shirt approached her. Captain Ellis would like to meet you, she said, handing Sarah a business card. Tomorrow at 10, if you can make it. Sarah stared at the card. I didn't do anything special, she insisted. The woman smiled. Sometimes the simplest acts of kindness are the most revolutionary. Captain Ellis, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, shook Sarah's hand in his office. The walls were lined with military photographs and awards. Heard about your Mr. Thompson, he said. No nonsense, but kind. You know, we've got a mural project, honoring vets. Ever thought about public art? Sarah's pulse quickened. Yes, but I'm not. Good, he interrupted. Be at the gallery tomorrow, 10 a.m., sharp. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She pulled out her sketchbook, turning to a fresh page. Ideas flowed, faces of veterans, symbols of service, threads connecting generations. By dawn, she had filled 12 pages. Sarah stood before the blank wall, her sketchbook trembling in her hands. The gallery's back room hummed with possibility. Sunlight through high windows, the tang of fresh paint. Captain Ellis crossed his arms. Impress me. She sketched furiously. Mr. Thompson's scar, Margaret's smile, poppies for remembrance, threads weaving through metals. Unsung threads. The title came to her in a flash. That's it, Captain Ellis said, studying her preliminary sketches. That's what we need. For weeks, Sarah painted. Dawn till dusk, her hands stained blue and gold. The gallery staff brought her coffee. Veterans stopped by to share stories. A World War II nurse described field hospitals. A Vietnam vet talked about his dog tags. Sarah listened, weaving their pain and pride into the mural. Mr. Thompson visited once, silent as he studied the half-finished wall. You got the eyes right, he said finally, pointing to a figure that resembled him. Sarah blinked back tears. Had some good reference material, she said, nudging his shoulder gently. As the mural progressed, Sarah found herself becoming part of the veterans' community. She'd stop by Mr. Thompson's apartment after painting, sharing tea and stories. He began to open up about Korea, the bitter cold, the comrades lost, the day he'd met Margaret at a field hospital. She'd been a nurse, patching up his shrapnel wound. She saved more than my arm, he'd say, his eyes distant with memory. Other veterans began inviting Sarah to their homes, sharing photographs and mementos. She incorporated these details into the mural, a particular medal, a letter from home, a lucky charm carried through battle. The painting became a tapestry of their collective experience, vibrant and haunting. Sarah's parents visited the gallery, her mother's eyes filling with tears as she saw the scope of the project. This is what you were meant to do, her father said, squeezing her paint-stained hand. The night before the unveiling, Sarah worked until midnight, adding final touches. Captain Ellis brought her a sandwich and coffee. You've done something important here, he said quietly. Something that matters. Sarah nodded, too exhausted for words. The wall before her, 20 feet of color and memory, felt like the most honest thing she'd ever created. The gallery buzzed with anticipation. A sea of blazers, champagne flutes, murmurs. Veterans in their dress uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with art critics and community members. Sarah's mural dominated the room. 20 feet of swirling color. Margaret's face gazing down, poppies blooming beside barbed wire. Veterans stood before it, some touching the wall, others weeping quietly. "This is Henry?" a woman asked, pointing at the portrait. Sarah nodded. The woman hugged her, whispering, "He never talked about Korea." "Thank you." Captain Ellis clapped her shoulder. "Sold out," he said, grinning. "Every piece." Sarah blinked in confusion. "Sold out?" "The prints," he explained. "We're selling limited edition prints of sections of the mural. Proceeds go to veteran services and your art education." Reporters swarmed around her, cameras flashing, but Sarah's eyes found Mr. Thompson in the crowd. He wore a crisp Marine Corps jacket, Margaret's photo pinned to his lapel. She led him to the center of the room. "This is for you," she said, voice cracking. "All of you." He gripped her hand, his calloused thumb brushing her knuckles. "You've got heart, Miss Sarah," he said. "More than paint." Later, as the crowd thinned, Sarah spotted her art fund jar on a pedestal near the entrance. It overflowed with checks and cash. Captain Ellis had donated a commission fee. The gallery promised a second show. A small plaque beside it read, "The Sarah Thompson Memorial Scholarship for Arts and Service." "Thompson?" she asked, raising an eyebrow at Captain Ellis. He shrugged. Seemed fitting. Not legally binding, of course, but symbolic. Sarah enrolled in art school that fall. Her first assignment, a portrait of Mr. Thompson. She visited him weekly, sketching as they talked. Their friendship deepened. He attended her student exhibitions. She helped him navigate the VA healthcare system. In his apartment, now comfortably furnished thanks to the community's support, she presented him with the finished portrait. A study in charcoal, his eyes steady, Margaret's photo framed beside him. "The Marine and the Artist," he read aloud. "Ain't much of a title." Sarah laughed. "It's honest." They drank Earl Grey tea, the steam curling into the light. On the counter, a new jar sat, labeled Thompson and Friends Fund in Sarah's handwriting. It was their joint project, supporting other veterans in need. "You know," Mr. Thompson said, watching the light play across her portrait of him, "Margaret always said that real art isn't about pretty pictures. It's about changing how people see." Sarah nodded. "I think I understand that now." Years later, the mural still graced the gallery, weathered but vibrant. Sarah, now a renowned artist with exhibitions across the country, returned on Veterans Day. Mr. Thompson, 92, sat in a wheelchair, a blanket over his knees, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Still got that sketchbook?" he asked. She patted her bag. "Always." He nodded, satisfied. As the crowd applauded, Sarah thought of that first empty jar, the groceries, the threads that bound them. Kindness, she realized, wasn't a sacrifice. It was a seed, planted in quiet moments, blooming when you least expected. Sarah's work had evolved over the years, but every piece contained threads of that first mural. The honesty, the connection, the recognition of shared humanity. She'd founded an art therapy program for veterans, taught workshops in VA hospitals, and established a foundation providing art supplies to underprivileged youth. And it had all begun with an empty jar and a bag of groceries. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah walked with Mr. Thompson through the gallery. New murals now accompanied hers, created by young artists she'd mentored, veterans themselves, finding healing through art. "Look at what you started," Mr. Thompson said, gesturing to the walls around them. Sarah smiled. "We started," she corrected gently. "I just helped carry the groceries." "And I just needed a little help," he replied. Funny how things work out. They paused before the original mural. Time had softened its edges, but its heart remained intact. The faces of veterans, the symbols of service, the threads connecting generations. Sarah's signature in the corner, once bold with youth, now seemed like a promise fulfilled. "You found it," Mr. Thompson said suddenly. "Found what?" "The heart," he replied. "In your market sketch, remember? You said it was missing something." Sarah stared at him, amazed he'd remembered that detail from their first real conversation. "I did, didn't I?" He patted her hand. "Sometimes you have to look outside yourself to find what's missing in your art." As they turned to leave, Sarah caught sight of a young girl in the corner of the gallery, sketchbook in hand, eyes wide as she studied the mural. Their gazes met, and Sarah smiled in recognition. The circle continuing, the thread extending, heart to heart, art to art, generation to generation, the most beautiful composition of all. As evening fell and the gallery emptied, Sarah took one final moment alone with her mural. She pressed her palm against the wall, feeling the texture of the paint beneath her fingers, each brush stroke, a memory, a connection, a promise kept. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. Her empty art fund jar had ultimately filled her life with purpose, her art with meaning, and her heart with a richness no oil paint could ever capture. The professional paints she'd eventually acquired had created beautiful works, but none compared to what she'd gained by giving them up that day. Sarah smiled, remembering Mr. Thompson's words from years ago. It wasn't about the paint at all. It never had been. As she turned off the gallery lights and stepped into the cool night air, stars shimmering overhead like tiny beacons, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly what her market sketch had been missing all along. Not just heart, but her heart. And in giving it away, she had found herself. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.